Hello, I'm John Schwander, also known as the allgraingamer, and today we're talking about Project KZAV. We had the audio was low, and you couldn't really hear what was going on for weeks 2 and 3. They record close to the same style as 1, so unfortunately it's only me today, but I'm going to combine the concepts of both week 2 and week 3 so that this video will have some weight to it, and next week's video will be hopefully perfectly okay and normal, and we'll be able to catch you up quicker this way as well. Now, where we left off on week 1 is we had our giant mess of concepts we got, and you can see it's very large, very ambitious. Not really sure where we're going. And what we did was we went over this, did some trimming, and cut this down to a bit more manageable size. So we have our concepts and ideas, and we go to our trimming, which is a lot more manageable. You can see the branches actually have meaning now. They're well spaced out, and it still has some size to it, but it's a lot more wieldable. So we have still a bit of ambition with this, and this is probably where you would aim a beta for. Now, some of this stuff is going to be something that you take out or you just cut early on. For instance, co-op is cut, so this entire tree is gone because we're not going to do multiplayer. I feel it would spread us too thin for our first project. But then there's stuff you just come up with that, like the gear that you want to add and would be cool. You leave it in there, see if you can get to it, and you think on the concept more and see if that's the direction you want the game to go. So we have our levels, which we're focusing on the platformer. That's where the boss fights will take place. Our early concepts for the theme. We have our leveling. We're still not sure what we're doing with that. That's okay. Things are still early. Same with gear. Co-op's been cut. Characters, we started to more theme ideas of what we're going with. How his weapon will act. Our shared health versus split health transformation for separate characters debate, which has been ever present. We talk a bit about the overworld, which is where our militia and the cities and towns and the temples will be, and our hopes for maybe having our RTS battle out in the overworld. Right here we have an army versus army RTS boss, which was kind of a cool idea that came from that. And even though we were trimming, we still added to this from our original. We had more direction, so we went a bit more in depth. Such as each region has unique mobs. We didn't want to have mobs be no longer important or used. A little bit of way to reuse models. And then we had to figure out how would that happen. What would having like weaker tier level 1 mobs in level 2 with our episodical release idea. We wanted our first temple per episode for our basis, just having a standard what will we release each time, how much content per episode, which is still working kind of like a patch system as far as we decide so far. Some extra details about the overworld and what how that episodical will play out. Originally we were thinking that though you would have your center map where you were and everything else you wouldn't see, and then as a new episode came out it would build upon that. now leaning more towards, like, you see the entire area, but portions are grayed out, and as a new episode is released, those grayed out areas become highlighted and you can go there. So that way it's just easier on the build, since we don't have to build new levels and all the hard mechanics and code are still there in the original release. And then we have some talk of our real-time combat, what's the payoffs, what's the risk, just basic stuff for that. And next, we have our alpha build. Our alpha build, very basic. We have just, you wouldn't even know anything about the game other than it plays with the alpha build. But the alpha build is just the start of the game's character. It's basic enough where you can show it off and show that it has potential, and has just enough of what you're hoping to accomplish that it has a bit of uniqueness or character. So once the first alpha is built, we'll be again adding the more in-depth features. Like, you won't see any RTS battles in the alpha build as it's currently labeled, but you'll see things like characters and special abilities, different enemies, upgrades being available. Those would all be added in, working towards a beta. So even though this is a very basic outline, this is not feature complete. We're just adding stuff. This is just our basic to look at it, judge it, see if we're in a good spot. If we are, we continue and we add on, and if we're not, we don't have so much built and so much invested that taking it all away is really going to hurt us. Now, mostly I'm going to ignore the names part for right now. On that in a section. And with the alpha build, looking back at it, I'm actually thinking, oh crap, we only want to do the platforming and not strategy. I was actually thinking that we would cut the strategy out until Phil and Dexter come back from summer vacation, and we would do paper prototypes to test out how we wanted to approach the RTS section. But since neither of us are well, let me go into paper prototypes first. You think of them like board games where you get to test out your concepts, and it's a cheap alternative. You don't have to worry about code. You can do it relatively quickly, but we're not being paid, so work and by the hour doesn't mean anything. And they're on summer vacation right now, so having them do some code is not a big risk. So it's something that we're just going to keep going at. But it was totally my fault that I didn't notice that, and we kept talking about it and thinking about it more as the weeks go on. I was just bad management, and the design document wasn't really stressing that we were only focusing on the platforming. So I dropped the ball on that one. But since we're so early, it's sort of okay. Obviously, you don't want to mess up or make mistakes, but if you're going to mess up, it's better to do it early on. Our alpha is starting to come together, so we can easily still make large and swiping changes to this game. Now, we talked about cutting out the multiplayer and the RTS, but that is actually coming back in. Now we have our level editor is done. Well, I kind of shouldn't have said that. We are on week 10, I believe we are going on to. And it is July 18th. So this all happened in late May. So our level editor you'll be able to see it in a few episodes. We'll actually have that a place you can download that and play with it yourself. But going back over to the alpha build, we wanted to have a level editor, an enemy editor, and movable terrain. Thinking back on that, I'm not all too sure what movable terrain is supposed to represent. I believe we meant platforms, moving platforms. If so, we're looking good on that end. Then we got our character movement, which we're starting to play with. And here's where you reach one of those crossroads of who's your audience. We have the hardcore platformers, like people who play Super Meat Boy or Dust Force. And we have the more casual platformer who enjoys Mario, or it's another good casual platformer. I guess I'd consider Rayman. It's not exactly casual, but it's not as hardcore as Super Meat Boy or Dust Force. It's not a big time attack that each second is going to cost you. It's for if we want people to worry about the story or worry about getting the best time. So we have our, do we want floaty jumps or do we want precise jumps? Of course, we want jumping to feel good, to not have too much sliding, to have direct control so that when you hit jump, it jumps. There's no lag, there's no build-up animation. Those kind of things can really kill a platformer. So we want to know how we want it to handle well, but we want to have that oh shit moment where you're in midair and you can change direction and try to get back to safety, rather than being committed as soon as you jump. We're still working on that right now, so we don't know how that'll turn out with what we have. And then we were talking of our dynamic versus standard aiming, which is mouse control or keyboard control. Originally I saw this as a Castlevania, Metroidvania-like game, and where you would target at an angle with the key inputs, but the mouse offers a lot more potential. So that's an argument we have a few times over the course of the weeks. I won't spoil what we eventually decide. Then we have our enemies with side against player lives, because even though it's a platformer and it's kind of feeling retro, don't really like using that word, but old school, it's a basic game. Not too flashy, but there's no point in having lives. It's more of a enjoyable, relaxing, casual experience we're going for than a hardcore niche experience. We consider it. And that's just our alpha, what our enemies will do, which is basically just run into them. No projectile attacks or anything as of yet. Later on, when I work on the design document, we address what each hit will do. That's a bit later on. Now, the names, as you can see, our project name right there. And some of these words seem weird. And the reason they came up with this is a technique I've used before for the Global Game Jam, which is just ask anyone in your team at random to just say a name. I asked Dexter. He said Xylo. Phil said Kevin. And I just made those the names of our protagonists. And we have Kevin and Xylo. And that's where KZAV comes from. Kevin and Xylo's Awesome Adventure. with the V capitalized because I wanted to avoid KZAV. Just cause, no real reason. Then we have a few more words. I asked them to just say a noun or say an adjective. I said spicy. I think Phil said running. Dexter said friendly. And I don't know who said flag. I could have those three confused. But they didn't really get used. I didn't really see the potential for them. So we just went with KZAV's Awesome Adventure. And that's a good way to get past any mental blocks. And it gets your team involved. Though once they know what you're doing, it kind of loses strength. So you have to keep it under wraps until you get all the names. So it just makes it sound like you're doing an ad lib. Is basically how the names came up. And that gives you a brief rundown of weeks 2 and 3, with week 1 included, where we had to do an overview. Unfortunately, we've only had about 4 hours of development time lost audio-wise. So you're pretty well caught up. I don't think there's any glaring issues that you were left unaware of. A bit of banter's been missed, but hopefully we'll make up with that for the next videos. Thank you for listening, and I hope next week is as good as I think it is. So really have high hopes for that. And I will see you then. This is Project KZAV signing off.